I hope you can hear me. I have a triple microphone. I have one because I do not like any unnecessary restraints on my freedom.
Great.
The only reason is that I'm deeply jet lagged, having arrived from Hong Kong only yesterday morning, so standing up and walking around helps me to stay awake. And when I'm in class, I always walk in particular to the back of the class, to make sure that everybody is listening. Now, how do we start this famine? It's very difficult to pick a point, but I always take 1953. We could have started with so-called land reform, when a majority of fairly poor farmers are incited by the Communist Party to kill a minority of relatively less poor farmers, but I will not do that. It's too complicated. What happens in 1953? A man who goes by the name of Stalin dies. Now, you may have heard of this man. He was the head of the Soviet Union, and he was also the leader of the socialist camp, which at the time covered pretty much half of planet Earth. Stalin's death was Mao's liberation. Mao Zedong had been living in the shadow of Stalin and was dependent on his money for the best part of his career. He thought that he, rather than Stalin, had brought a quarter of humanity into the socialist camp. And he thought that he, rather than Stalin, had managed to fight the imperialists, the United States, to a standstill during the Korean War. Surely now he would assume the mantle of the socialist camp. This would not happen. Another man called Khrushchev instead became the leader. Some pronounce his name as Khrushchev, but I still remember from my Russian studies that it's Khrushchev. He was a coarse, impulsive, erratic man, best remembered for banging his shoe on the podium at a session during the United Nations. Mao had nothing but contempt for him. When Khrushchev invited all the leaders of the socialist world to come to Moscow in 1957 to celebrate the 40th birthday of the Bolshevik Revolution, Khrushchev was full of visions. He assured all his listeners that the Soviet Union would overtake this country, the United States, in the production of certain dairy products, milk and butter, within 10 years. Mao Zedong saw his opportunity. Without even standing up, he announced that China would overtake the United Kingdom, which was then still seen as an industrial superpower, within 15 years. This was the start of the Great Leap Forward. How would he do it? I'm not entirely sure he knew at that point in time. But he certainly believed that the real wealth of China was in the hundreds of millions of people in the countryside. If only he could transform every man and every woman into a soldier, and that was the slogan in the summer of 1958, everybody is a soldier. If he could transform all these people into foot soldiers in a giant army that would command his every beck and call, that would go and be deployed from one task after the other like a military army, tackling, for instance, giant water conservancy projects during the slack winter months before working in the fields and forging iron in backyard furnaces after work. If only he could deploy these people in a continuous revolution, then surely he would be able to catapult his country past its competitors. The People's Communes appear in the summer of 1958, and everybody in the countryside is herded into these massive collectors. Before you know it, people have nothing left. The grain they produce is procured at a price which is often below cost of production. The tools and utensils are collectivized. Women and men are separated. Children are sent to kindergartens. Sometimes people work inside the fields just like the army, like brigades that are deployed to work there. This, Mao believes, is the golden bridge from socialism to communism, the people's communes. Well, we know what happened. Tens of millions of people died of hunger. So when I set out to research this period, when I arrived in Hong Kong in 2006, I expected quite fully to encounter people who starved to death in the archives. And I remember my very first trip to the Guangdong Provincial Archives. I took a train in the morning from Hong Kong. You clear customs, you buy a coffee at Starbucks, you get on the train, 2-3 hours later, you are in the archives. And I remember on day 2, not so much reading about famine, but going through a report about a county in Guangdong called Luoding, where a boy aged 12 was thrown into a pond and left to drown, where hundreds of people were made to undress and work naked, including women, in the middle of the winter, where children were being locked up into cages normally reserved for hogs because they'd fallen asleep during a meeting. I was startled. At first I thought that maybe this was very peculiar to the South. Maybe the Cantonese were more violent than others. But then, over a period of about 3 years, I spent a total of 6 months in very different archives. Gansu in the north, Hubei in the middle, Guangdong in the south, Shandong to that side, Hubei to the other side. About 10 provincial archives. And I found that the violence was endemic. Extraordinary levels of violence used against women, the elderly, children, and just about everybody else. People were bound up, tied up, thrown into ponds. Some of them were made to kneel on broken bricks for stealing a potato. In Sichuan, they were doused in petrol, some of them set alight and burned to death. In Hunan, burying people was so common that Zhou Xiaozhou, the head of that province, actually felt obliged to speak out against the practice. I remember reading a report where a cadre called Huang Xiongdechang, in a small village in Hunan, forced a father to bury his own son alive because this kid had stolen a sweet potato. This man died of grief several days later. The case of Wang Ziyo was reported to the top leadership. Here is also somebody who just stole a handful of food to try to stay alive. One of his ears was chopped off. His legs were tied up with iron wire. Somebody dumped a 10-kilo stone on his back, and for good measure, he was sizzled. He was branded like an animal with a sizzling tool. That was reported all the way to the top leadership. By all accounts, in the archives, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe 10% of the people who died were beaten to death, tortured to death, some of them buried alive. So all of a sudden the mystery became, how do you explain so much violence? I was expecting people to somehow pass away of hunger. Well, the reason was quite clear. It's called the principle of the carrot and the stick. There were no carrots left. As I said earlier on, every incentive to work was removed from the cultivator. People woke up to the bugle call and had to respond every command of the local cadre. They had no tools or utensils anymore. Their homes were taken away. Their own work schedules were determined by the man in command. And the food they produced in any event was taken by grain inspectors. Why even bother working? Before you know it, the cadres on the one hand and the farmers on the other hand were locked in a very vicious cycle. The farmers had no incentive to do anything. The cadres on the other hand had to whip up the workforce in one relentless drive after the other in order to fulfill and over-fulfill the plan. Before you knew it, both cadres and farmers were locked in a cycle of violence, where the scope and degree of coercion had to be constantly expanded. This is one reason. But there were other reasons for that. In these collectives, people had to be fed. They had to be housed. They had to be clothed. And all of that came at a cost to the collective. The planned economy reduced people to mere digits on the balance sheet, a resource to be deployed in the name of the greater good, like coal or grain. The state was everything. The individual, nothing. Is worth constantly assessed through work points and determined by the ability to move earth or plant rice. So from these very bleak calculations came quite naturally a logical desire on the part of the cadres to get rid of people who didn't contribute through their labor to the regime. There wasn't enough food anyway to even feed strong, healthy farmers who were working all day long. So all of a sudden, those who were too weak or too old or too sick to contribute were being banned from the canteen. So instead of violence with a stick, what we get is violence through the use of hunger. Hunger becomes a form of punishment. Food is a weapon used to punish people. And food is a weapon deployed to eliminate people who are seen to be undesirable, unfit, unhealthy, those who speak out during meetings, those who fall asleep, women who are too pregnant and hence cannot work anymore. All of these people are banned from the canteen, deliberately starved to death. There are teams of inspectors in Sichuan who go to the countryside in 1961 and find that roughly 60, 70, sometimes 80% of the people who died had been banned as a form of punishment. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that violence is essential. Coercion, terror is the foundation of this regime. But on top of that, the people who die of hunger are not people who starve to death. They're people who are being starved to death. And this is a crucial distinction, absolutely crucial distinction. People are being starved to death, a form of punishment. So, how many? Very difficult to say. And when I set out to do my research, I had no desire at all to try to come up with some sort of number. If only because it was the regime at the time that tried to reduce the sheer complexity of human activity to just numbers, digits. But I came across so much material that I felt obliged to use it and compare it with the other estimates that had been produced. Every single estimate till then has been produced on the basis of officially released population statistics in the People's Republic since 1984. These estimates vary from roughly 12 million towards 30, 32 million. One expert has used county annals, which are also based on public figures, to come up with an estimate of about 31 million, cao su qi. So what I did is I compared the statistics I found inside the archives with the published figures. Extremely detailed numbers, which were compiled by a team of workers sent into the countryside in the wake of the famine in 1962, sometimes 12, 50 strong. Statistics compiled by the Public Security Bureau all along through the famine. I'll give you one example, a document beautifully handwritten with all sorts of numbers added up by the very man who was in charge of the Provincial Public Security Bureau in Sichuan. The province was about twice the size of France as you know. And here this man announces to his boss, Li Qingquan, that about 10 million people have died unnecessarily under his reign from 1958 to 1961. It's on the basis of all sorts of reports from investigation teams, from the Public Security Bureau, from statistical workers, from others who went back in 1964-65, just before the onset of the Cultural Revolution, to try to find out what had happened. I come up with an estimate of at least 45 million people who died unnecessarily. And of those 45 million at least, something like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% were beaten to death. The word famine is a misnomer. It should be genocide. When we talk about Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, we look at 8 million people, and by various estimates, 1.6 to 2.4 million died under Pol Pot, out of 8 million people. A minority died in camps like Tuol Sleng prison, where I think something like 14 to 20,000 were killed. Most of them were worked to death, as during the Great Famine. Now, if you take a region I personally had never heard of before, till I started this project, Fuyang, the Fuyang region in Anhui province. Well, it had 8 million people, same number as Cambodia. According to historians who worked for the party, 2.4 million people died. It's the exact equivalent of Cambodia. If you take the genocide in Cambodia under Pol Pot and you multiply it by 40, you get somewhere near what happened in China under Mao from 1958 to 1962. Multiplied by 40, you get somewhere near what happened. Extraordinary. But of course, it wasn't just a famine in which people are being starved to death. The whole system collapsed. The whole economy, culture, society on which Mao staked his prestige collapsed. The transportation system creaked to a halt before it collapsed altogether. In Shanghai alone, by 1959, there are goods worth hundreds of millions of yuan which accumulate along the side of the railway, on roads, rotting away. In Zhengzhou, a crucial railway junction, the man in charge digs a hole 6 meters deep because this stuff is coming in. The planned economy sends in trains, but there's nobody there to take care of it. So it's all dumped into that massive black hole. From bags of cement to expensive machinery and spare parts to actually run the trucks that might help to distribute this material. In Hunan in the summer of 1959, 200,000 tons has been collected through forced procurements. This grain is waiting along the roads. There are not enough trucks. 60,000 tons is collected. 140,000 tons is not collected. It rots away. Well, in the countryside, in some villages, people have to forage for roots or eat mud to somehow try to get by. Extraordinary contrast. How about nature? We will never know the exact impact of the Great Leap Forward on nature, but there was a prolonged and intense attack that stripped some provinces of about half of its forest, as farmers go out there and cut down the trees to feed these backyard furnaces, to stay alive, to sell it, to somehow stay warm. Water conservancy projects I mentioned earlier on, which are carried out by hundreds of millions of farmers in forced labor, which for the most part are utterly futile. In fact, destroy nature, creating landslides, water silting, soil salinization, and devastating inundations. Hu Yaobang himself travels with a team along the Yellow River during the inundations of 1962, writes back to the center, quote unquote, to say that all of this is caused by these water conservancy projects. dams, canals, badly designed, badly built. Housing. There's something else I read during my first week in Guangdong. That somebody tore down his house to produce fertilizer. When I read it, I thought, well, that's clearly a marginal case. I'm not going to look at that again. But again and again and again, I found that people in 1958, in order to get fertilizer, were tearing down their houses. Well, it makes a little bit of sense. If you have a mud hut in which you keep animals, there might be some organic matter. You reduce that. You spread it over the fields. But before you know it, here's a local party activist who volunteers to tear down his own house. And others feel obliged to follow. And if you don't do it, you get punished through hunger. That's one reason why houses disappear. There are a zillion other leaders. Here's a local cadre who sees communism right ahead, beckoning in the future. He decides to destroy the village so that it can be rebuilt. Skyscrapers. Nothing ever gets built. The plan never manages to migrate from paper into the ground. Houses are taken by the militia as a form of punishment when they go around to find more grain and suspect farmers of hiding it, which of course they do. They destroy it. Or if they can't find anything, they take part of the house as a form of payment. Houses are straightened to make place for some road which is never built. Bricks are taken to build these communes and kindergartens. Liu Shaoqi in Hunan in early 1961 spends a couple of weeks investigating the situation and writes to Mao Zedong to say that 40%, 40, not 40% of all the houses have been destroyed in the province of Hunan. In places, some places in Sichuan, it goes up to 80% of the houses. Some villages have a house left. This is bigger than any of the mass bombing campaigns of World War II. Destruction on an extraordinary scale. Now, I've talked about destruction. I do wish to move on a little bit for another 10 minutes, so I still have some time, to talk about how people tried against all odds to survive. Well, first of all, apathy at work. People tried to save every little bit of energy. Posters extolling model workers who overfulfilled the plan, loudspeakers, blaring out exhortations to work harder, but on the factory floor, people tried to do as little as possible. In the countryside, they may well work, but once the cadre has walked past the field, they will just drop their tools, sit by the roadside and wait for the end of their shift. In some parts of the countryside, they place their own sentries along key intersections in the fields in order to sleep through the day. Sometimes they huddle together, literally hibernate through famine. But of course that's not enough. Stealing time is essential, but in the countryside in particular, people actually have to steal food in order to stay alive. As we heard this morning, as Harry Wu told us, he became a master thief. Anybody who wishes to survive must steal. And stealing starts even before the grain is collected from the fields and the countryside. Harking back to a tradition called shiqing, which means to eat green, farmers try to somehow clip off spikes of grain before it has even reached maturity, and thresh, ground the rice in their hands, and eat the raw green kernels when out of sight from the militia. Many stay alive thanks to that. Once the grain is collected and bagged, it is bulked up with water, with or without the complicity of grain inspectors. But less has to be delivered to the state. Never mind that the grain will then rot because the water content is too high. Once grain is on the move, it's exposed to a plethora of thieving hands. In Guangzhou, shippers stick bamboo tubes into grain bags, suck out the grain, replace it with sand. At every level, from those who guard the granaries to the cooks in the back, grain is filched. To the extent that only roughly about 50% in a city like Suzhou, 50% of the grain ever reaches a canteen, public canteen. Of course, even stealing might not be enough. Sometimes that passive shield that outsiders' mistake for passivity and submissiveness breaks down in the countryside. And angry farmers assault carders with cleavers. A lot of the violence is collective. By 1961, large groups form along railways and try to stop anything that moves and take everything that moves. In Gansu province in January 1961, there are hundreds of cases where farmers assault trains, freight trains. In one case, 4,000 farmers wait and strip everything on the freight train like locusts. In another case, some of them actually find uniforms. They don these military uniforms, approach a granary, and magically the doors just open because they're mistaken, of course, for local militia. In the case of Hunan, in one county alone, in the winter of 61 to 62, out of 500 granaries, 30 are assaulted by angry farmers who take the food. Most of the time they take the food, but sometimes they even torch the granaries. In one case in Guangdong, they leave behind a message. The message is pretty clear. It says, "This grain is not ours. We might as well burn it." Very clear message. There are rebellions that appear in Xuanwu, Yunnan, that spreads from villages to encompass an entire county. The army has to be sent in to quell it. There are dozens of similar uprisings. Qinghai has to be reconquered by the army along the highway. Violence is everywhere. But of course, thieving, assaulting granaries, trying to get by is one thing. Bit by bit, there is not an awful lot left for very poor farmers to steal. And as the moral fabric of society starts to unravel, they turn against each other. The family itself becomes an arena for strife, jealousy, extraordinary levels of violence by man against their own women and children. In Liuhe, a small village just outside Nanqing, there's a man called Wang Jiuchang who systematically takes the grain ration of his 8-year-old daughter. And when the winter starts, he takes away her cotton padded jacket as well. This girl starves of cold and hunger in the middle of the winter. There are countless cases where family members assault each other. And this probably is the real tragedy of it, is that in such conditions of starvation, all too often one man's gain is another man's loss. Those shippers I mentioned earlier on who suck out grain from bags in Guangzhou seem like heroes, but of course somebody else down the line will be chewing on grit. When the farmers hide the grain, the workers just outside the village starve to death. So it's tempting to think about this culture of resistance as something quite heroic, as a party against the people in terms of black and white. But all too often, with mass starvation, moral degradations go hand in hand with mass destruction. Primo Levi said it very well. Of course, he survived Auschwitz against all odds. He was one of the few to manage to get through it. And one of the first things he said is that having survived the Holocaust, he realized that the survivors are not really the heroes. The heroes are dead. The heroes are the ones who shared food. The heroes are the ones who looked after the others. In order to survive, as Primo Levi did, he had to think about himself first. And he made it very clear that when a man places himself above others in order to survive, his sense of morality changes. Primo Levi called this the gray zone. And I would call this entire period from 1958 to 62 not only an enormous black hole at the very center of modern Chinese history, but also a massive moral gray zone, which we've only just started to explore. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Frank, I have one question related to the title of your book. I have one question related to the title of your book, since your book is Mao's Great Famine. So would you please outline some points about Mao's responsibility to this great catastrophe?
Yes, so the three words, one I addressed already, famine, and I've called it a misnomer. I use the term famine for lack of anything else, because genocide does seem harsh. But these are crimes against humanity that rank with the Holocaust and the Gulag as one of the three greatest disasters of the 20th century. Great, that needs no debate. Mao is the man who starts this, and Mao is the man who ends it. And this is very clear if you read documentation. It starts, as I said, you could start all the way in 1949 or even earlier. Jasper Beck was very clear in bringing all this back to the Hunan Report of 1927, and the role of terror and violence, and the whole vision of a communist society. But quite clearly, the movement to purge intellectuals, the Fanyo, anti-righteous campaign 1957, ships away about 500,000 students and intellectuals to labor camps. I don't think they'll be speaking out in 1958 against the Great Leap Forward. But what we tend to forget is that that campaign wasn't just directed against intellectuals, it was a purge of the ranks. There were top leaders of provinces in Yunnan, in Gansu, in Henan, who were toppled. Thousands of leading cadres replaced by hard, unscrupulous elements willing to follow every order from their chairman. And then Mao Zedong himself bullied, not number 2, but number 3, Zhou Enlai. And Zhou Enlai, rather than step back, took it, and then became a humble servant. Zhou Enlai is the man who decided that all that food should be exported. Zhou Enlai is the man who calculated how much food should be taken from each of these provinces. So Mao is the man who sets the tone. And Mao knows precisely well what is happening, because like any other dictator, Adolf or Joseph or Pol Pot, he has a very sophisticated system of information. He's been trying to find out who's the liar from the moment he joined the party in 1921. You tell me he just believes the reports he gets? Of course not. He's on his own personal secretary to go out to find out what's happening. He gets all sorts of documents that tell him precisely what is happening. Even before the Lushan plenum in the summer of 1959, when things go pear-shaped, according to more or less conventional history, even before that, 3 months before, Mao is the one who decides to increase procurements, not decrease them. Mao is the one who says, take up to 30% of the grain. Procure up to 30% of the grain, farmers will not rebel. Mao is the one who says on the 25th of March 1959, in the Jinjiang Hotel, which is wonderful, by the way, if you ever go to Shanghai, stay in that hotel. Mao's the one who says, let half the people die, provided the other half can eat its fill. Let half the people die, provided the other half can eat its fill. There are those who say, well, that might just be a metaphor. Well, then my question is, what kind of metaphor is that? Is it a metaphor for saying that half the people die is a metaphor for like 1/5 of the people die? This is exactly what happens. He transmits very clear instructions, which are carried on by Tan Zhending, again in the summer of 1959, even before Peng Dehuai speaks out. He says, Tan Zhending says, you must fight the farmers. If you do not fight the farmers, then there is something ideologically wrong with you. Now, this is a war against the countryside. And the main instigator is Mr. Mao.
Frank, I'm curious about one question. When you conducted field research in China, how much cooperative you feel the archival person? How much you feel about the government control over the archives regarding those 3 years catastrophe? Were there any, or how much you wish you want to get, but they didn't want to let you to see that?
Well, it's very difficult to say what is it that archivists really think and what they do to do things. Some of them rant and rave against communism. They should have been sent to a labor camp a long time ago. They rant and rave and go on about how everything is just horrendous in the People's Republic. I always try to disagree politely. Then there are those who just seem pretty strict. But the bottom line is, there's an awful lot of material in these archives, city archives, county archives, provincial archives. And even, as has happened in quite a few cases, if you don't get to see a lot, there's still so much there about this or that aspect of this period, that there's enough there to keep you going for a while. And then there are archives which, at least before the Olympics in 2008, were quite open. In particular, I don't want to give any names, but you can tell from the footnotes a couple of provinces which have extraordinary amounts of material. So with a little bit of sensitivity and with a little bit of patience and with a lot of hard work, one just finds an awful lot of material there. But don't forget that it's a rather large country, and like all dictatorships, there's a massive bureaucracy. So the reports being copied and sent around and preserved, sometimes missing here, sometimes you can find it there. It's a wealth of material, absolute wealth of material.
Thank you.
We started late, so we're running late. So how about the last question?
I'm just curious about
Yes.
How would they allow you to access those archives? What year did you go to China for the first time?
When I was a little boy. No. in 1999.
Wow.
In 1999, I started working, I spent 20 years working on the Republican era up to 1949. And I did what I think, with some modesty, might be seen as one of the first books to really use multi-archival research on the Republican era, a book which Guotian very kindly mentioned on prisons pre-49. And already then I noticed that bit by bit material was becoming available on post-49, so I've kept an eye on it. And in 2006 I felt that there was a real sea change there where you could really get to see a lot of material. Let me anticipate a question which some have, but may not wish to ask. How come a foreigner like you can read this material?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly that I want to know.
你到底能看到多少? Well, I'll tell you what. You can use the back door or you can use the front door. I use the front door. And I'm
So
polite.
who would be the first bureau you have to go through?
The front door will be the front archivist. You present your letter of introduction. And then sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is okay. And sometimes you get to see an awful lot. You just have to try. But in many cases, these archives are far more willing to cooperate and far more willing to go along than one might think. And there's only one mistake that one can make. It's to have a prejudice. To think that Gansu province is very conservative, so I'm not going to Gansu. But to think that Shanghai is very open and everything works very well, when in fact there's zilch to be obtained because everything interesting has been removed already. The only mistake is prejudice. If you try and you're open-minded, you might be really, really pleasantly surprised.
Thank you.
I've noticed on the program, the 7 to 7:30 at Laogai Museum, right? There will be a Q&A session. by Professor Frank Dikotter and Mr. Yang Yisheng. So you can, if you have questions, you can have it. Thank you.